The parish house was cloaked in the kind of stillness that only the late hours of the night can bring. The room was bathed in the gentle glow of a single lamp tucked in the corner, its light spreading a warm, golden hue. Reverend Alice, a woman in her early 50s, sat in a well-worn armchair, her posture straight despite the weight of the day. In this quiet sanctuary, she wasn't just Alice. She was the Reverend, the figure her congregation relied on, the name that carried respect and expectation. Her head rested against the back, eyes closed, as though sleep had finally claimed her. In moments like this, when the weight of the collar felt heaviest, she wasn't Reverend Alice. She was just Alice, tired, human, longing for something she couldn't name. But the lines etched on her face told another story, a tale of long days spent leading her congregation and shouldering the many demands of her role. Her thoughts churned beneath the surface, refusing to quiet. For years, her faith had been her anchor, her guiding light. Yet now, something shifted. The growing pull toward Liam, the way his presence lingered in her mind, felt like a betrayal, not just of her vows, but of the version of herself she had worked so hard to cultivate. Was it a weakness? Or something far worse? Tonight was no exception. Exhausted, she had sought refuge here, away from the unending expectations. Yet, it wasn't just fatigue that anchored her to the chair tonight. There was something else, something darker, more dangerous. A feeling she couldn't quite name, one she didn't dare to fully acknowledge. The quiet was broken by the soft creak of the door. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't fully open. Instead, she stayed motionless, feigning sleep as an unmistakable presence entered the room. Her heart clenched at the sound, torn between the desire to see him and the dread of what it might mean. She had spent weeks ignoring the quiet thrill of his company, the warmth that unfurled in her chest when his eyes met hers. But here, in the silence of the night, that boundary, the one she had drawn so carefully, felt perilously thin. If I let this happen, who will I be when the dawn come? It was him, Liam, the young man who had been assisting at the parish for several months now. He was in his late 20s, with dark hair and an intensity that seemed to surround him like an aura. From the moment they met, she had felt inexplicably drawn to him. Liam lingered in the doorway, his gaze fixed on her. She could feel his eyes roaming over her face, her neck, the gentle rhythm of her breathing. Slowly, almost as if compelled by a force he couldn't resist, he moved closer. The old floorboards barely groaned beneath his deliberate steps. Yet to Alice, each sound seemed magnified, echoing in the quiet room like the beating of her own heart. Time stretched impossibly thin. With every step he took, she felt herself drifting closer to a moment she couldn't undo. Should I speak? Send him away? The questions tangled in her mind, but her body betrayed her, frozen between fear and longing. Alice, he whispered, his voice low, uncertain. The title felt too heavy for a moment like this, too distant. Here, with the dim light and the closeness between them, she was only Alice to him, a woman, not a reverend. She remained perfectly still, letting the moment stretch. She could sense his hesitation, the way he teetered on the edge of propriety and something far more primal. It sent a thrill through her, dangerous, intoxicating. Against her better judgment, she craved more. His breath was close, a soft warmth that made her heart pound faster. She felt the tension in the air, charged with unspoken words. Slowly, his hand hesitated near her shoulder, as if he were searching for permission, unsure of the boundaries that separated them. She felt the hesitation in him, a mirrored reflection of her own. Say something, Alice, she urged herself, but the words stuck in her throat. The silence between them grew louder, thicker, until finally, his fingers grazed her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she stayed unmoving, her senses attuned to his every action. Then, she felt a faint, tentative touch on her shoulder. His fingers hovered, testing boundaries, testing himself. Alice, he whispered again, his voice heavy with reverence. The sound of her name on his lips sent a shiver racing down her spine. It was forbidden, and yet it felt utterly natural. His hand lightly touched her arm, a hesitant yet deliberate gesture. When she didn't move away, his fingers slowly brushed against hers, lingering just enough to make her breath catch. The warmth of his touch was steady, grounding, and left her more aware of the space between them than ever before. Every fiber of her being screamed that this was wrong, yet she couldn't bring herself to let go. With a soft sigh, she stirred, pretending to wake. Her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his. She feigned surprise, her voice coming out soft and breathless. "Liam? What are you doing here?" He froze, caught between retreating and staying close. For a moment, his face betrayed uncertainty. But then, something shifted in his expression, an intensity, raw and unguarded, that stole her breath. I couldn't sleep," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I couldn't stop thinking about you." Her heart skipped a beat. She knew she should send him away, remind him of the lines that couldn't be crossed. She opened her mouth, the words forming, but as her gaze met his, they dissolved. His eyes, so raw, so unguarded, pinned her in place. There was a softness there, a plea, a vulnerability that weakened her resolve. The air between them grew charged, heavy with unspoken truths, until finally, against her better judgment, she leaned in. "And what were you thinking about?" she asked, her voice soft, inviting. His eyes flicked to her lips, his inner struggle playing out in the furrow of his brow. Slowly, his trembling hand rose, brushing against her cheek. The warmth of his touch ignited something deep within her, a fire she had tried desperately to ignore. And in that fleeting moment, the world outside the room seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them, teetering on the edge of something neither could name. Liam's voice dropped to a whisper, filled with raw emotion. "I was thinking about this," he murmured, his face so close to hers that she felt an intense tension building inside her, as if the weight of the moment was too heavy to ignore. When their lips finally met, it was hesitant, a tentative gesture that seemed to test a delicate boundary. She froze for a moment, her conscience urging her to stop, but something deeper held her there, an undeniable connection she couldn't yet name. For once, she allowed herself to fall. That was all the invitation he needed. He let out a quiet sigh, leaning closer with a mix of resolve and hesitation that made her breath catch. Her hands lifted unconsciously, lightly touching him, as if seeking something to hold on to in this fragile moment. She parted her lips slightly, allowing the moment to unfold, her body instinctively leaning closer as the tension between them grew. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, a touch she hadn't allowed herself to crave in years. For once, she wasn't Reverend Alice, the priest, the counselor, the guiding light. She was just Alice, a woman being seen, being desired. The weight of that realization sent a thrilling shiver through her. "Alice," Liam breathed against her lips. His hands rested hesitantly at her waist, his voice low and strained. "You're making this so hard for me." A smile spread across her lips, surprising even herself with its boldness. "Then let me," she whispered, her voice husky with need. "I want to see you lose control." He exhaled sharply, drawing her closer with a sense of urgency that felt both tender and overwhelming. His hands moved over her, exploring, discovering. His hands hesitated on her shoulders, and she drew in a shaky breath, feeling the weight of his touch and her own conflicted emotions. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his lips brushing against hers as his hands continued their journey. "So damn beautiful." A breathless laugh bubbled out of her, her body trembling beneath his touch. "And you," she whispered, teasing, "are a very bold young man. Kissing Reverend Alice like this." The words felt strange on her tongue, a sharp reminder of the boundary they were crossing. But when his lips brushed hers again, the title faded, leaving only Alice. "I don't care," he growled, his grip tightening possessively. "I want you. I need you." Her heart raced at the intensity in his voice, and though every rational thought screamed at her to stop, her body moved of its own accord. "And what if I said I needed you too?" she murmured, her lips ghosting over his. Liam groaned, his hands pressing firmly against her hips before he captured her mouth in another searing kiss. The world around them faded as they lost themselves in each other. Her hands roamed over his body, feeling the strength beneath his shirt as she pulled him closer, their connection growing hotter, more urgent with every touch. Without hesitation, he shifted, guiding her back onto the couch. She went willingly, her breath hitching as his body pressed against hers. His hands moved with a confidence that left her trembling, exploring her waist, her thighs, her breasts, igniting a fire within her that she couldn't extinguish. "Liam," she gasped, her voice trembling as his lips trailed down the curve of her neck. "Oh God, don't stop." He didn't. His lips pressed warm, open-mouthed kisses along her throat, each one sending shivers racing through her. His breath was hot against her skin, and when his hands brushed against the hem of her blouse, pausing as if unsure, and she felt a shiver course through her as the space between them dissolved. "Alice," he murmured, his lips brushing over her collarbone as his hands slid higher, over her ribcage. She felt the tension in his fingers as he paused, his gaze lifting to meet hers. His dark eyes burned with an intensity that made her heart stutter. "May I?" he asked, his voice low, husky. She swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling with each unsteady breath. Logic, duty, and every rule she had ever followed told her to say no. But the words refused to come. Instead, she nodded, her gaze locked on his. With a trembling hand, he rested his touch lightly on her arms, his hesitation palpable as he navigated this unspoken boundary. The sensation sent a jolt of pleasure surging through her, and she gasped, her back arching as heat flooded her senses. Every nerve in her body seemed to come alive, overwhelmed by the electric connection between them. It had been years since anyone had touched her like this, years since she'd allowed herself to feel so deeply, so completely. And yet, the weight of her role pressed heavy on her chest, threatening to suffocate the fragile pleasure she now clung to. She was Reverend Alice, trusted, respected, an emblem of restraint and wisdom. If anyone ever knew what was unfolding here, her name would no longer carry reverence. It would carry disgrace. And yet, even as shame gnawed at the edges of her mind, she couldn't silence the voice inside her, a quiet whisper, insistent and undeniable. This is what it feels like to be alive. The thought terrified her as much as it thrilled her. Liam's voice broke through the haze, low and filled with awe. "God, Alice, you're perfect," he murmured, his hands moving over her in slow, teasing circles that sent shivers through her body. His lips found hers again, capturing them in a kiss that stole her breath. The kiss was deeper now, hungrier. His tongue slid against hers, demanding yet tender, drawing a soft moan from her as her fingers tangled in his hair. For a fleeting moment, she pulled back, her breath shallow as her gaze searched his face. Is this really happening? The thought felt distant, almost surreal, as though she were watching someone else step into a life she didn't recognize. But then his hand slid gently along her arms, his touch grounding her in the present, and she gave in. The heat between them grew, every kiss more urgent than the last. She felt his presence close, his proximity undeniable, as his hands brushed against her blouse, and she hesitated before moving, allowing him to proceed with an unspoken understanding between them. The garment fell to the floor, forgotten, as he paused to take her in. His gaze roamed her bare skin, reverent, almost as if he were seeing something sacred. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice trembling with sincerity. His hands followed his eyes, tracing the contours of her body, the curve of her waist, the gentle swell of her breasts. Leaning in, he pressed his lips softly to her shoulder, then moved lower, placing a lingering kiss on her skin that made her breath hitch. Her hands gripped his shoulders, desperate for something to anchor her as his lips continued their slow, deliberate exploration. Each kiss seemed designed to unravel her, to pull her deeper into the moment. Her body trembled beneath him, caught between anticipation and overwhelming need. "Liam," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "Please." He lifted his head to look at her, his eyes dark, filled with an intensity that made her heart race. "Tell me what you want," he murmured, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin just above her breast. "I want you," she breathed, her voice unsteady. "I want to feel you." His gaze sharpened, his desire flaring visibly. With a soft growl, he dipped his head, capturing one of her nipples in his mouth. Alice gasped, her body arching as a surge of pleasure rippled through her. He sucked gently, his tongue flicking over the sensitive peak, drawing soft, breathless moans from her lips. His hands lingered at her sides, their presence both steady and cautious. She felt the weight of his gaze and the unspoken tension in his movements, each moment a question rather than an assumption. Her breath hitched as she realized how dangerously close they had come to crossing a line she had sworn never to breach. She bit her lip, her breath catching as his hands moved higher still, exploring the smooth skin of her legs. "You're trembling," he whispered, his voice rough with want. "I can't help it," she managed, her voice barely audible. "I've never felt like this before." His lips curved into a faint smile as he murmured, "Good. I want you to feel everything." His hands moved with purpose, slipping higher until his fingers brushed over her through the thin barrier of her panties. The contact sent a jolt of heat through her, and she gasped, her hips lifting instinctively. His touch was gentle yet firm, deliberate yet teasing, and it was all she could do to keep breathing. Soft moans escaped her lips, unbidden, as he leaned down, pressing a kiss just below her navel before trailing lower, his lips ghosting over her hip. When his fingers brushed lightly, her body tensed, reacting to the unspoken intensity between them. She was aflame, every nerve alive, every inch of her crying out for more. "Liam, please," she gasped, her voice raw with need. "I need you." A deep growl rumbled in his chest as he moved with deliberate care, his every action measured, as though testing the fragile balance of what they had begun. She felt the pull of his presence, an intensity that left her breathless. Each gesture, though restrained, carried an unmistakable depth of emotion, leaving her both terrified and exhilarated by how easily she let herself fall into the moment. Her hands clutched at his shoulders, desperate for something to hold on to as her world tilted. He moved with practiced, reverent precision. His gestures, though restrained, seemed to carry an intensity that drew her further into the moment, each one amplifying the emotions swirling between them. Her breaths filled the room, shallow and uneven, as she felt herself caught in the overwhelming tide of the moment they were sharing. When the moment finally reached its peak, she felt an overwhelming surge of emotion that left her trembling, her voice catching as she called his name. She clung to him, her breaths coming in shallow gasps, but the storm inside her refused to settle. In Liam's arms, she felt safe, desired. But as her gaze drifted to the faint outline of the cross on the wall, a sharp pang of guilt cut through the warmth. "What have I done?" The question whispered through her mind, relentless and unforgiving. She tightened her grip on him, as though holding him closer could silence the voice within her. It didn't. He held her close, his body warm and solid against hers, his breath hot against her skin. As they lay there, tangled together, her heart still racing, one thing became painfully, inescapably clear. There was no going back. In the dim light, she felt the weight of both names pressing down on her. Reverend Alice, the leader, and Alice, the woman. For the first time, she wasn't sure which one she wanted to be. The boundary between them had blurred tonight, leaving her adrift in uncharted waters. Her gaze flicked to the faint outline of the cross on the wall, and a pang of guilt clawed at her chest. What she had done felt both like a betrayal and a revelation, an act that had shattered her carefully built world, yet left her feeling alive in a way she hadn't in years. The warmth of Liam's presence beside her only deepened the conflict, drawing her closer even as her conscience warned her to pull away. Would this fleeting moment with Liam be worth the price of everything she stood to lose? Her congregation's trust, her faith, her sense of purpose? The thought was terrifying, yet she couldn't silence the quiet, rebellious voice inside her that whispered, "You deserve this." As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, she let out a trembling breath. The question lingered, heavy and unanswered. When morning comes, Who will I choose to be?